I think the biggest thing for me is to be informed, one way or the other, that you have choices, whether it's to do the genetic testing, to not do the genetic testing, how you use that information, what decisions that you make. It is not a one-way road. It's a conversation that can happen at any time. I have patients who are 18, 19, come and see me, and we have the discussion about testing now versus testing in 4 to 5 years and what that looks like.
My mom has stage 4 cancer in her bones and in her breast. My dad's disease was 15 years, he died of ALS. I made a podcast about death, seemed like the thing to do. And if you're sad by all of this, well, you're gonna die too. Hey, I'm Chelsea London Lloyd, the host of Dying of Laughter. And if you're new here, welcome. Each week we interview comedians and funny at heart humans in the wellness and entertainment spaces about the losses mostly of their parents and siblings. If you're recently grieving, there are no words to describe how XYZ insert adjective that doesn't make you feel better. I am. And I'm always sad/glad that you are here, sad that you are potentially grieving, glad that you have found another human, aka me, that laughs through pain and has a little bit of a lighter approach to grief, should that be possible. Now, today, I am so looking forward to sharing this episode because this is an episode with a genetics counselor. It's not like something I've done before on this show. I'm just so passionate about spreading awareness surrounding genetics counseling. It's not something that I knew much about until a few years ago, and it blew my mind, and I've just been kind of on the journey to learning more ever since. So today we are speaking with Erica L. Silver, MS LCGC. She is a licensed and genetics counselor specializing in cancer genetics and hereditary cancer symptoms. She received her bachelor's degree from California State University, Northridge in cellular and molecular biology. She then completed her master's degree in genetic counseling at the University of Pittsburgh. She's board certified by the American Board of Genetic Counseling and holds a genetic counseling license through the California Department of Public Health. Her interests include the decision-making process to proceed with genetic testing and how individuals use the information to help make management decisions. Erica is currently practicing at UCLA, so please check her out at uclahealth.org/Erica-Silver to learn more about her and the accepted insurance plans that she takes. She also shares an email address that you can get in touch with her office directly at the end of this episode. Very full circle moment because Erica was my guest at the Dying of Laughter launch party last January. I clearly feel very passionate about what she has to say since she was the guest of my launch party, and anyone who attended the party was really a Q&A with her. I am shocked at how many people have never heard of Braca, much less know if they have it or not. Now, roughly 1 in 40 healthy Ashkenazi Jewish women will have Braca, and roughly 1 in about 300 women in other populations will have Braca. This mutation is becoming increasingly more discussed, and yet there is no permanent recommendation by any doctors or board that says everyone should find out if they have it. And I don't share information to scare people or to be an alarmist in any way. I just really think that knowing your options, knowing what this mutation is extremely important because breast cancer affects roughly 1 in 8 women. And there's so many women, and the fact that so many people don't know what BRCA is, I think is problematic. So yay, that will no longer be you because you are here and you'll get to figure out more about genetics counseling and specifically the BRCA mutation yourself. At the time of this interview, I had not tested myself. It is possible by the time it comes out that I have proceeded with that test. Feel free to DM or email me if you would like to know. Okay, lots of info. Strap your bucks on, strap your boodles on, even though you might be at home. But I don't know. Now's the part where we cut out because it just starts getting weird. This advice is in no way a recommendation as to what you should personally do. Always consult with your doctor. And if you are still confused, understandable, specifically seeing a certified genetic counselor who specializes in these subjects can be a wonderful way to go and figure out all the options pertaining to you, your unique genetics, and your unique situation. If you like what you hear, sharing this one with a friend would mean so much to me. I'm so passionate about getting this information out there. I took off ads for this episode because I just don't want it to be about that. I want it to be about sharing this information. It is so important. So getting off my soapbox now. Oh, and last tidbit, if you hear a baby or baby adjacent sounds, stay calm because A, babies are adorable, and B, those sounds do subside after about 10 minutes of the interview. Shout out to Erica and busy working doctor moms who are giving their time for free to podcasts while juggling families. So again, after about 10 minutes, you will no longer hear those sounds. We love it. Yodo, you only die once. Well, thank you so much for being here, Erica. I cannot believe it's been 1 year since the podcast launch event. That's crazy.
I know. It seems like a lifetime ago.
I know you're so busy. Can you give the listeners a little rundown? I will have a bio before you come on, but a little bit about your experience as a genetic counselor and where you are in life personally, because I know you have some exciting things happening.
So I have been a genetic counselor for over 8.5 years. I currently practice at UCLA as a cancer genetic counselor. So I specialize in hereditary cancer syndromes and hereditary cancer risk. So in my practice, I see patients who either have a current diagnosis of cancer or they have a history of cancer, or they have a family history of cancer and they're concerned about their risk. And so a majority of our discussions are regarding, pros and cons of genetic testing, what we do with that information, and then what appropriate recommendations we might need to make after we potentially do genetic testing. So that's majority of my practice. I have other responsibilities. I do work in a couple of working groups at UCLA as the genetics voice, but majority of my time at work is in clinic seeing patients. In my free time, which is not very much. I am married. I have a 2-year-old little boy. We are welcoming a new addition in the spring. So we are one of the many who jumped on the COVID baby bandwagon. So it's just kind of been adjusting to life. I've actually been working remotely since March, which has been awesome being home with our son, but it's also been really challenging being at home with a toddler and also still working.
Right.
But, I'm sure many of your listeners can relate to challenges and changes in life over these last, basically a year.
Absolutely. And congratulations on being pregnant. I just found out right before I asked you that, so I wanted to ask you again officially. That's so exciting. Yay, pregnancy.
Thank you. Yeah, we were surprised, but also we're very excited. So we're 2 and done, and our kids will be close in age. So it'll be awesome, but ready to be done being pregnant, to be very honest.
Really? Yeah. Wait, how many months along did you say you were?
I'm almost 7 months.
Oh, wow. So thanks for sharing your experience on what you do as a genetics counselor. I think there are some people that it surprises me to this date, which is why I'm so excited to have you, still have very little to no idea what a genetics counselor does. Do you mind sharing what an appointment might look like when they book something with you? And it doesn't mean they have to get their blood drawn right away, right? You're just talking first. Can you share about that, what that first visit might look like?
Yeah, it actually is very surprising how many people have never heard of a genetic counselor. It is definitely a growing field. So I think more people are hearing about it as medicine and technology becomes more sophisticated and genetic testing becomes more standard of care in the way that we treat not only cancer, but other common diseases. But typically a visit with someone like me who specializes in cancer is we first really dive into someone's family history. So we ask a lot of questions about how many brothers and sisters they had, if they have children, are their parents living or passed, aunts and uncles, grandparents. We try to get an idea of what their full family picture looks like We ask, of course, about any relatives who've had cancer, what type of cancer they've had, what age they had when they had their cancer. So a lot of these questions, some people know, but some people just don't know the details. And so we try to prompt them to ask those questions before the visit, call their 85-year-old mom, or, contact that cousin that maybe you haven't spoke with in a couple of years. If they feel comfortable and if they're able, just trying to get as many details as possible, because it not only helps them better understand their family history, but it helps us in the appointment to have a clear picture of what we might be seeing in the family. So that takes up a good chunk of time because, we're asking some details and trying to understand patterns in the family. Family dynamics is always something that we run into. So just trying to better, me as the clinician who's just meeting somebody for the first time, trying to better understand what those family dynamics are so that I can be better prepared to discuss recommendations with the knowledge of, okay, my patient may not have a great relationship with this individual, or this individual, has sort of pulled away from the family, or whatever the case might be. Then we sort of go into the biology of genetics. So I always joke, we give a little bit of a sixth to eighth grade biology lesson in about 2 minutes during our visit, just talking about DNA and genes and cancer and how all of this is wrapped into one little, present that we're talking about. And then we spend the majority of the rest of the visit talking about whether or not the individual is a candidate for genetic testing, whether they meet their insurance criteria or there's medical necessity for the genetic testing. Then we talk about what tests are available. Technology in genetics, like technology in everything else in the world, is always changing and evolving. And so there's always different tests and genes and companies that we can use. So trying to find that perfect fit for that patient. So we talk about different testing options, obviously pros and cons of genetic testing in general and the different tests that we offer.
Right.
We talk about logistical things like insurance coverage, insurance discrimination for genetic testing.
Oof, that one.
In the world of COVID, we talk about how we're going to be getting the DNA sample, whether it's a blood sample, whether it's a cheek swab, whether it's saliva. And so typically, I'm a fast talker. So typically appointments with me take between 30 minutes and an hour. Mm-hmm. But you can imagine when you're going through all of those details, it's not your typical, routine physical with your doctor, where it might last 15 to 20 minutes. We're really trying to get deep down into your personal history and your family history of cancer and figuring out what is the best option. And like you said, you don't have to have your blood drawn or you don't have to consent to the genetic testing. It's really more informative. It's very conversational. Yeah. We want to educate our patients on the appropriateness and the options for genetic testing, but knowing that it's ultimately an option and that they have all the power to say, yes, I want this, or no, I don't, and feeling confident and comfortable with making that decision one way or the other.
Absolutely. And you're like you're the genetic counselor that I feel like everyone, I want you to be my genetics counselor. I hope my insurance can work with you. Seriously. I think that there's really no reason not to see a genetics counselor. I'm biased. I'm having you here. I'm passionate about it. And yet I still haven't done it. So I can also understand why people can have reservations. So I was hoping to go into a few of those pros and cons. A pro being you're finding out information that is potentially going to save your life. A con being not everyone can mentally equip themselves. Do you see yourself as somewhere between a doctor and, I don't want to say therapist, but is the counseling portion to help people feel more comfortable, would you say?
I will say, the education that we receive in our training to become a genetic counselor. So I have a master's degree in medical genetics and genetic counseling. So the degree is very specific to the profession. And it really has a fantastic balance between the medicine, being able to understand medical jargon, being able to translate that information into terms and words and phrases that the average individual who doesn't have that level of training can still understand.
Yeah.
And an equal balance of psychosocial training, how to talk to people in emotional or stressful situations. And, being able to use those tools to not only still get that medical information across so somebody can make a good decision about whether to have the genetic testing, but also feel like they're heard by somebody who's taking 30 minutes to an hour to sit with them and talk to them. So yeah, definitely not a physician, definitely not a therapist, but I definitely think our profession has a good balance of that. Because, we're talking about family, we're talking about family dynamics, family members who've passed. It a lot of times can bring to the surface a lot of emotional, stressful, anger. And so that maybe they've suppressed or they haven't wanted to deal with. And when you start asking those questions about those individuals, sometimes it can bring it to the surface. And so being able to work your way as the clinician with your patient, working them through those is really key to building that relationship with them through your visit.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a wonderful balance. It's like the ideal balance, right? Mm-hmm. Someone that's knowledgeable about your actual medical needs, as well as someone who can communicate with you. Because my mom has a fantastic oncologist at UCSF, and she's very, very intelligent. She's one of the best available, which is a huge privilege. My mom can see her, and sometimes delivers very difficult news in a very blunt way. So thank you for bridging gaps between these difficult worlds. Very, very important. So I would like to speak specifically today about BRCA. I literally still call it BRCA, and I'm pretty sure you're supposed to say Braca, and I've been talking about this for a year. First question, do you call it BRCA or Braca?
Both terms are appropriate.
Okay, good.
We typically say Bracca just because it is easier.
Okay.
But there's not a wrong, technically you're supposed to spell out the gene name, so BRCA. But in everyday use, it becomes very tiring. So we typically say, BRCA1, BRCA2, or the Brca genes.
Okay, great. So glad we have this clarified. See, we're really going there.
There we go.
There we go. So it's really, really frustrating to me as someone who is the daughter of a breast cancer patient, and I know you have experience with breast cancer as well in your family. It's very frustrating to me that many people with breast cancer do not have the BRCA mutation. So this conversation today is not going to pertain to a majority of breast cancer patients, which is quite upsetting and frustrating. However, because breast cancer is so common, so many people have it, there is a very large population of people with the BRCA mutation. And I think if we can help those people, so it only affects a small group of people, and yet there's still so many people with this mutation. Do you find that most people you see are specifically seeking information about BRCA, or are they coming with like a blank slate? What are we going to do today? I hear this was a thing. How has that been progressing?
I would say it's a really good mix of both. In my practice, I see people who have done a lot of research, Google being research. You've done a lot of research and Googling. And so, when you Google hereditary breast cancer or you Google genetic breast cancer, you're going to see Brca. That's the most common cause of hereditary breast cancer, but only accounts for about 5% of all breast cancer diagnoses. So there are patients that come to me with a decent amount of knowledge from Googling. And I would say those people are the ones that say, I want the Brca test.
Right.
Which is fine. What we do know is, although BRCA1 and 2 are the most common cause of hereditary breast cancer, there are other genes that are also associated with hereditary breast cancer. So for those patients that say that to me, there's education that we do that says, okay, yeah, you're definitely going to have testing for BRCA1 and 2. You may also have testing for these other genes that can cause hereditary breast cancer. And so it's educating them that there is more beyond BRCA.
Right.
Then there's people that come in and say, I'm interested in genetic testing. I have no idea what it has to, I have no idea what the process is. I don't want to Google because I don't want to scare myself. My doctor just told me to come.
Right.
So I think we definitely, and it may also be the population of people that we see in Los Angeles. You know, they tend to be well-educated, well-informed, tend to be more affluent. But then we also have the other end of the spectrum where we do have individuals who are perhaps lower health literacy, English is their second language. And so, you know, it provides challenges on both ends when educating people on either there's more than just BRCA or here's everything that we need to talk about.
Wonderful. Yes. There's no right or wrong way to do this, right? I mean, knowledge is power is generally what I default to. If there's some people that are really, really anxious and don't think it will serve them, you know, that's understandable. However, I'm of the experience that finding things out can only help you. Do you think that by a certain age, every single person should eventually go through with this? I do, but what do you think?
You know, there's a lot of discussion about whether or not genetic testing should be, you know, offered to the general population. So meaning anybody who's interested would therefore have the option of proceeding with it. It has obviously not been adopted for multiple reasons. You know, there's ethical reasons, there's insurance reasons, there's liability reasons. My feeling personally is anybody who is eligible and interested should absolutely proceed with genetic testing. You know, if you're thinking specifically about breast cancer, only 5 to 10% of all diagnoses are hereditary. So like your point earlier, you know, breast cancer is so common. There's so many people out there that have breast cancer or have family members who've had breast cancer where it's not hereditary or it's not genetic. And so genetic testing isn't necessarily going to provide them with the information needed to make appropriate screening recommendations or, you know, provide the answer, you know, why they got breast cancer.
Right.
But for the people that meet criteria that are eligible for genetic testing, if they're interested in having it, they absolutely should. There are people either that have cancer or who have a family history that for many reasons are eligible, but are not interested in testing. And I think part of, frankly, living in a free world, but also because of our consent process, we want them to feel comfortable making the decision to say no, to say, yes, I understand that this could be important information for me. I understand that I meet criteria for it, but at this time, this isn't information that I'm looking for. So it is finding that balance. But information is absolutely power. And I think being proactive is always a benefit, but not everybody thinks that way. And that's okay to be empowered to make the decision that is how you feel.
That was so well said. I completely agree. I would love for the world to reach a place where everyone knows about the option. So if you are choosing not to proceed, it is a choice and not a result or a reaction or a lack of action, because most people that don't know about it, I'm like, how they're not making a decision. The decision is made. And to your point of so many people having breast cancer, you know, I say this all the time. Even though my mom was first diagnosed when I was 8, most of my life experience was surrounding my dad's illness with ALS, which was fatal. So even when my mom was a breast cancer survivor, which was the case for most of my life until a few years ago when it returned, I even had eye rolls about breast cancer. Like, everyone has a breast cancer story and it's overwhelming, and the pink and, you know, fatigue of hearing about it. And I just never thought it would be such a huge part of my my life and specifically my mom's life. And because it is so common, I feel it is my duty to keep having these honest discussions and not just make it about a pink ribbon, even though, you know, I get the pink ribbon thing too, though, because it is such a huge, huge, unfortunate thing that so many people have cancer. And yet you can make a difference in some people's lives, even though it's only 5 to 10%.
Exactly.
Right. To my knowledge, it's about 1 in 300 people that have the mutation, or if you're Ashkenazi Jewish descent like myself, it's about 1 in 40. Is that correct to your knowledge?
The 1 in 300 is a typical stat that we quote for Caucasian individuals. But yeah, basically we're talking the commonality of Brca mutations is definitely less than 1%. But yes, in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, that frequency does rise to about 2.5%, 1 in 40.
There were people at the event last year that you spoke at that went and tested after finding that out, which was such a amazing result. And they were negative, thank goodness. But God forbid if they were positive, you know, what a good thing to know. Before I ask my next question, why is it that Ashkenazi Jewish people are more affected? Besides the fact that once things are in your genes, it just continues to be in your genes. But when I first found that out a few years ago, I thought, how bizarre. And now I'm used to it. And I'm like, yep, that's what it is. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's something called the founder effect. It's a genetics phenomenon that can happen really anytime in history. But specifically, the founder effect is based on the idea that a certain population of individuals do not have a large pool of genes to reproduce through. If you think about our time now, you know, migration has happened. It is much more accepted to have children with individuals who are not of your ethnicity, of your race. And so you are able to cross the gene pool with new genes to your population. The founder effect really occurs with Ashkenazi Jewish individuals with the idea that in many, many generations prior to us, they tended to marry within their culture, have children within their culture. They tended to not go outside of their ethnicity. And so those genetic mutations that maybe weren't as prevalent early on in that ethnic group, as they continued to have children and generations continued down the line, those mutations continued to progress down, where natural selection typically would occur, where if somebody had breast cancer at a young age and passed away, then perhaps that bloodline would end there. But as you're having people, you know, marry close, either, you know, within their faith or in some cases close relatives, those mutations just continue to be generated through the populations. In other cases, the founder effect can actually be caused by geographical factors, you know, indigenous people on islands or in the mountains. You know, if a geographical isolation does not allow for migration, then they still have that same gene pool to perpetuate the generations with.
Right. And of course, I met my boyfriend in Israel, a Goldstein. There is 0% non-Jewish blood in anything happening to potential kids. So there you go. There you go, baby. It's like the proof is in the pudding. But because you just think about genetics of like, oh, but all these people so many years ago, how is it still trickling down? And yet that's the power of biology.
And I will say, typically, it's also, you know, if you think about Bracca, although it typically causes early onset cancers, people are still getting to the age where they can have children before they may develop their cancer. So you're still able to pass the mutations to your offspring before you know, in the most unfortunate scenario, you develop cancer and you pass away. Or before you may even know that you have that mutation, if you wanted to explore other options for having children to prevent passing that mutation on. So once a mutation is sort of cemented in a lineage, it particularly these adult onset conditions, it's a little bit harder for it to trickle out because you may not necessarily know that it's there until after children have already been had.
Right. In the instance of the other guest speaker at the event, their family found out about the mutation, and Devin, who was the speaker, was BRCA positive and was able to have surgery to have her breast removed. And it's a huge deal. And yet it could be life-saving. Whereas her sister, unfortunately, did get breast cancer. And I say this with so much respect to their family. One of my goals is to prevent that from happening in the future. Is people with a family lineage can at least find this out and be proactive and have preventative surgery so that in the worst case scenario, they don't get breast cancer themselves. Have you seen a lot of people who have had family members with breast cancer? And what is that experience like for you? Does it feel so frustrating to know it was preventable in a sense? How do you speak to that?
It's a good point to bring up. I mean, I think genetic testing in the breast cancer world has been around for over 20 years. I mean, we've known about Bracca for that long, but it really hasn't become as standard of care until about maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And even then, the criteria to get genetic testing was very narrow, and the cost of the testing was very high. So a lot of people in, let's say, the early to mid 2000s who probably would have benefited from genetic testing, they may not have been able to get it. Even if they were interested, they may not have been able to get it because of financial barriers.
That's horrible.
Thankfully, those barriers have really started to crumble in the last few years, with insurance criteria becoming much more broad, and the cost of testing has dramatically plummeted from what it used to be. So the availability and the accessibility of genetic testing has become much easier for people to get if they're interested. Right. To your point about frustration with, seeing somebody who has a family history of breast cancer, it's definitely a huge part of my practice. A majority of my patients the referral is for some indication of breast cancer. Either the patient themselves has breast cancer or they have a family history. In the case of the individuals who have breast cancer, sometimes they can be the first one in their family to develop breast cancer. And they might be on the younger side, and that's why they're eligible for genetic testing. And so it really wasn't something that was on the forefront of their mind because their family history didn't support that hereditary pattern, when in fact, the mutation could have just been passed down through individuals in the family who never presented with cancer. And so my patient being now the first individual, so in those scenarios, there's not a whole lot we can do in terms of preventative genetic testing. Because
that's what's frustrating to me, the lack of education. I mean, a young girl with breast cancer that didn't have to have breast cancer if there was universal testing available is frustrating to me personally.
And you're not alone. But like I said, there's a lot of logistical things that we have to consider when we start opening that door up. Because, part of the issue becomes, how are these results going to be interpreted when they're done? If they're done, like a 23andMe or an Ancestry.com approach, where
we don't like that approach, right? You said you didn't like that. I don't think that's the best approach, but
no. But if somebody just says, "Hey, I want to have the genetic test," and they just, they can, there's no safeguard on how those results are interpreted.
Right.
If if genetic counseling were to become a requirement for general population screening, there's just not enough of us that exists to be able to do that. So a lot of it for us in the genetic counseling profession is also trying to educate other providers, like primary care doctors, OBGYN, radiology offices that offer mammograms, and trying to also get them to help us identify those patients that don't have cancer, but perhaps on their intake form for their mammogram or for their physical exam, they know a family history of cancer. That should be something that we consider genetic testing for that family. So we try to help educate those individuals to help us.
And random podcast hosts.
and random pod.
Well, because everyone needs to know.
Yeah, really, the idea for us is we want anybody who is interested and eligible to be able to have access to genetic testing. Like I said, insurance has become much easier for us to work with. Financial aspects of genetic testing is become much less of a barrier for most people. So it is becoming an easier route for people to pursue.
That is good news. Thank you for always bringing it back to a positive. I'm always like, and I'm so upset. You're like, well, and here's the good that we're doing in this world. And to clarify the 23andMe and Ancestry.com, I know we had talked about in the event, which I find fascinating, is 23andMe specifically tests for a few variants. So your BRCA results can say negative. And while those are the most common ones, you technically could have a less common variation and you could be Brca positive, even though 23andMe says negative. Is that correct? How do we feel? I have so many thoughts.
So Ancestry.com is specific to Ancestry. So that's good. 23andMe, as many of your listeners probably know, does also provide ancestry information and health information. They have been allowed by the FDA to report the Bracca mutations that are common in Ashkenazi Jewish individuals. So like you said, there are 3 common mutations, but they are prevalent in 99% of Ashkenazi, or I should say, if an Ashkenazi Jewish individual has a Bracca mutation, 95 to 99% of the time, it is in one of these 3 mutation locations. So if a person undergoes testing through 23andMe and their results are negative for Bracca, if they are of Ashkenazi Jewish descent, it definitely rules out the majority of the chance that they have a Bracca mutation, but not all. If the person undergoes 23andMe testing and they are not Ashkenazi Jewish, they will more than likely test negative, but it is considered a non-diagnostic test because it's only looking at the mutation specific to one ethnic group that patient does not fall into. Right. So yes, we have a lot of people that come in with their 23andMe results. And we have to, and that's exactly what we say. What is your ethnicity? Okay. Then this is the side of the coin that you fall into. The other thing that 23andMe does allow you to do is it allows you to download the raw data on the back end. And then you can upload that raw data to a third-party company that, quote, translates it. And so we also have patients that come to us with their interpreted raw data that may show they have a mutation in a certain gene, like Bracca or some other breast cancer gene. And what we know clinically is those results are not validated by the mechanisms that we require when a person undergoes appropriate genetic testing through an appropriate laboratory. And so more often than not, I want to say it's like maybe 50% of the time, it may even be higher than that, that those raw third-party data points that a patient comes back with end up not being anything to be concerned about. So the ultimate message is 23andMe is a great resource if you want to know where your family came from. Mm-hmm. If you have interest in, random health things, like they test to see if you have the gene for sticky versus hard earwax, right, or if you smell asparagus after you use the restroom. But to make significant health decisions like heart disease, diabetes, dementia, cancer, it is something that we caution people to, do the test, that's fine, but definitely speak with your provider.
Right. Thank you for that clarification. I think that's really important. And I have personally spoken with people last year who saw I was doing the event and said, oh, I did the 23andMe test. I'm Brca negative, with little to zero regard that may not be the full picture. So I find it frustrating. It's like, buy this Mother's Day, this fun thing. You can find out about your history. And it's really great that it's available. And thank you for bringing up those specifics regarding those important health decisions.
Any type of ancestry testing through any platform is definitely an area of interest for many people. I mean, my sister is fully down the rabbit hole of ancestry testing. I mean, she actually found a long lost cousin on my mom's side of the family in Ireland, and they traveled to Ireland to meet him and his family.
What?
So it is a really, really cool thing. My husband, before my husband and I got married, he did the testing mostly because he didn't really know. He just knew his family was from Oklahoma and Mississippi. Mm-hmm. Wanted to have, we joke, what am I mixing my good genes with his? But it's uncovered some interesting things about his family. So, there are pros and cons to any test that you do, whether it's something that seems relatively benign, like an ancestry test. People are discovering things about their families that they had no idea about. Yep. But also to things like that have major health implications, like a genetic test for cancer risk.
Yeah, we won't go into the full details, but I found a first cousin. My family found that on 23andMe.
But definitely, yep. I think with these ancestry tests, I think it's been really great for people who've been adopted, who maybe have been trying, are interested in finding their birth families.
Yes.
Like I said, for my sister, it's been really interesting tracking family. My dad's family, we have a ton of records from when they came through Ellis Island, and they were living in Ukraine before they came here. But with my mom's family, they're basically Irish immigrants. We didn't have a lot of information. And so it really has been incredibly interesting, not only for my mom, but my grandparents before they passed. It was, oh, that's so-and-so's child or whatever. And just taking your grandparents back to when they were children and remembering those relatives that made an impact for them at a young age. So it's really interesting, but I would say take the health information for what it is.
A question that people probably have listening to this right now: if I have Brca, what next? And people can undergo with a double mastectomy. You can get your ovaries removed. You can freeze your eggs, which I think is really powerful. It's being called a previvor, and yet I can see how that would be really overwhelming. You can also just choose to get screened a lot more regularly. Can you speak to some of the options available?
So individuals who have a Brca mutation, or theoretically other breast cancer gene mutations, we always try to emphasize that there are options. And specifically regarding breast cancer management, women typically have the option of considering either surgery or screening. Screening is the use of a mammogram, ultrasound, MRI, in a way that screens an individual at a younger age more frequently, so that if they develop a cancer, we catch it really early when it's more treatable. If it's smaller, it hasn't started to spread anywhere. That's the ultimate goal of screening. It's not reducing the risk of any type of cancer. It's just close watching. All women also do have the option of prophylactic surgery, as you mentioned, having a double mastectomy. that surgery is obviously a much bigger decision than just having more frequent screening, but it is an active way to reduce your risk of breast cancer. A mastectomy can reduce your risk of breast cancer by approximately 90%. So it is a much more definitive way to combat your risk, but it's a big surgery. There are lifelong things to consider. For young women, it does remove the opportunity to breastfeed children if they want. There are reconstruction options that can have, long-term impacts on sensation and things like that. But for some women, taking that definitive route is the best option for them. Typically, I see younger women electing that if they have family members who've gone through cancer and they watch them battle it. Or if they have a diagnosis of breast cancer and they find out they're Brca positive, more often than not, they say to me, I don't want to have to do this again. And so that might be a reason to do the double mastectomy. But there are a lot of things to take into account when making the decision one way or the other. And that's part of our role as a genetic counselor, is to kind of walk them through that. Here are your options. Here are things you might want to think about. Take some time, talk to the people in your family that are important to you, to ultimately come to that right decision. In terms of ovarian cancer risk and Brca, we do recommend for younger women, so women in their 30s, early 40s, we do recommend screening. Ovaries are obviously very important, not only for childbearing purposes, but also bone and heart health. So we do recommend screening in that time. However, our ultimate recommendation after a woman has completed childbearing, and typically we say, between 35 and 45, depending on family history, genetic mutation that is present, the ultimate recommendation is to consider having the ovaries and tubes removed. So that is something that we do recommend. And we try to walk them through the pros and cons of that, because, it does put a woman directly into menopause. So there are things to consider with that. But unlike a mammogram, MRI, ultrasound, that's really good at finding early stage breast cancer, the screening that we have for ovarian cancer is not as effective finding early stage ovarian cancer. To your point about freezing eggs, if a woman, of course, is diagnosed with breast cancer and might need chemotherapy, or if she has ovarian cancer and she needs surgery, she may elect to have her eggs frozen or embryos frozen to be able to have children in the future. I have some patients that may actually elect to have eggs and or embryos frozen as a way to do genetic testing on those future children, so that they don't pass that mutation on to their offspring. It is an expensive process. It is a long and arduous process, but it's an option that's available and for some of my patients, it's a very important option that they consider.
Right.
But I think the ultimate thing to think about is that there are options. You don't have to day one get your genetic test results and day two have surgery everywhere. It's a process that you have to kind of come to terms with, that there may be things that in your body that you need to change and that you may want to change and that your body is going to change, and kind of accepting that, or deciding I'm not ready to make those changes, but I have options that are less aggressive, and being comfortable with that.
Thank you for clarifying that. So if you are Brca positive or you're worried about being Brca positive, thank you for reiterating there are options, surgery being the most extreme. And yet there's really wonderful online groups where people share their experiences. Some girls, I know they waited a few years to get the surgery as a previvor. And I also know girls who have chosen not to, and yet every few months are getting quite rigorous screening in the sense that it's more often than someone who hasn't had this experience, but they haven't had surgery. So they get more blood tests, they get their breasts checked a lot, very often, and MRIs and things like that.
Yeah, there's definitely ways to get more information. I mean, I know a lot of our surgeons at UCLA, if somebody comes to them, they have previous patients of theirs that say, you know, if you have a patient that is concerned or has questions, you know, they can connect you with previous patients. They, you know, a lot of our plastic surgeons have pictures of outcomes, so you can kind of see what your breasts will look like after reconstruction. So yeah, I mean, I think the online support is available. The physician support is available. You know, there's a lot of support options that we as genetic counselors can help guide our patients to, you know, again, just to help them through this early part of their journey.
Wonderful. And while we're speaking of breast health, I was hoping we could clarify a few things in terms of your journey with breast health, even if you have no history. I've been from the research that I've done, to my knowledge, 40 is generally when mammograms start, or if you have a history 10 years before that. And then every 6 months, I have my breasts felt by my primary care physician, and then my gyno, and then pap smears, and then a yearly blood test just in case anything shows up. Are there any proactive things? Oh, in addition to feeling your own breasts once a month, are there any other proactive things before age 40 that healthy women without a history should consider?
Everything that you just described is what we tell people, you know.
Yes.
learn what your breasts feel like, so that, you know, when you're in the shower, you want to be able to give yourself an exam, seeing your primary doctor, your OBGYN, you know, once a year, twice a year, whatever you feel comfortable with, for that clinical breast exam. For active screening, you are correct. Mammogram is recommended to start at 40 and have an annual mammogram after that. If you have a family history of breast cancer in somebody who was diagnosed under the age of 50, then you would start screening 10 years before that diagnosis. So if your grandma or your mom or your aunt had breast cancer at 45, then you would start screening at age 35.
Right.
We do make a cutoff. We don't recommend mammogram screening before age 30. It's not an effective tool for women that young, just given the way that their breast tissue looks on the mammogram. So we typically say start at 40 unless you have family history, 10 years before that diagnosis, but not before age 30.
Right. Thank you so much for clarifying that. Yeah, my mom was 44, so I'll have a few more years, but it's definitely, something that I've thought about. Knowing me, I should put it on my calendar now. I mean, I would never
I'm
forget.
surprised it's not on your calendar.
I would never forget anyways, but that's just, it's a lot to think about. And, you know, there's some people that say screening too much, you know, radiation or, you know, mammogram can cause breast cancer. Is that true? And what is the best way around that?
So when you have a mammogram, there is a small amount of radiation that you are exposed to. If any of your listeners have ever had a mammogram, I have. It is a very short procedure. It's not like you're in there all day under the machine. So it is a very short duration of a low amount of radiation. But in general, yes, we want to avoid excessive amounts of mammograms so we can reduce the cumulative amount of radiation, which is why you don't get a mammogram once a month. It's once a year. What I typically tell people that have concerns about that is it's all about balancing risk. You know, what is the risk that you develop breast cancer based on your family history or any other risk factors versus this risk of this small cumulative radiation exposure. That's why for women who have no risk factors, no family history, they have never had any concerning breast biopsies, anything like that. That's why we wait till 40, because breast cancer before that in the general population is really uncommon. So we find that mammogram really starts to be most beneficial in women who are who are 40, who are in their 40s. And then they have a mammogram once a year through the rest of their lifetime as they remain healthy. For women who have bigger risk factors, a genetic mutation like Brca, strong family history, other risk factors like biopsy findings or things like that, their risk is higher. And so they may need to start screening earlier to combat that higher risk, which still may slightly elevate that cumulative radiation risk, but their other risk is still much higher. And so that balance, that cost benefit still shows in that favor.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is so helpful. I'm so looking forward to sharing this. So I appreciate that. Just a few more things. So I wanted to present two situations, myself and one other person, in terms of, are we candidates for genetic testing, for a second, without going too far into it, because I don't know what I'm even comfortable sharing. See, we're on this journey together. But okay, so just to share, my mom did genetic testing 20-something years ago when she was first diagnosed. Brca negative. When it returned 17 years later, they said, hey, there's a lot of more things we can test. We should test again just to be safe. Tested negative again. So she's definitely negative as far as we know in terms of BRCA. Her aunt died of breast cancer. Her mom died of leukemia. And she was diagnosed originally at 44. And of course, it came back. And then on my dad's side, both of his first cousins who are female had breast cancer, which I know a parent's cousin is considered a little bit farther out. It is just interesting that they're sisters and they both had it. So how at risk do I seem to be based on that information? If you care to share, I just think it might be interesting to people. Like, what would you say to someone like me?
So I think there's two things to consider. Number one is risk, and number two is genetic testing. In terms of genetic testing, if your mom has had appropriate up-to-date genetic test, then the medical answer is that you do not need genetic testing. Your mom cannot pass on something to you that she doesn't have. Now, that doesn't mean that she doesn't have a genetic mutation. It could be in a gene we haven't discovered yet, or a technology can't pick up, and your mom is a prime example of how technology changes. She had Bracca testing 20 years ago, and then now I'm sure she was tested for a much bigger handful of genes.
Yes.
So in that case, if your mom has had updated appropriate testing, then in terms of your need for genetic testing, relatively low. Now, what we do know is, and I should say to your point about on your dad's side of the family, dad's first cousins for you are, as you said, more distantly related to you. And so the impact of their diagnosis on your risk is sort of gets watered down because of that degree of separation between you and them. Also thinking just sort of in the very black and white perspective, these are considered first cousins once removed for you, which would not be captured by insurance criteria. So again, just thinking the logistical aspect, just that one thing to think about. Now, I do offer genetic testing to individuals like you where I don't necessarily think they need it, but if they're motivated and they want to have a report with their name on it, I'm happy to help facilitate it. But I definitely plant the seed, based on the way these genetic mutations are inherited, the way medicine works, we are unlikely to find something. But it's a conversation that we have. The other side of the coin with this is your risk of breast cancer. We know that 90% of women with breast cancer, their diagnosis is caused by non-hereditary gene factors. So there's a possibility that your mom could still be in that hereditary group, like I said, but in a gene we haven't discovered yet or something else, or our technology can't pick up. Or it's possible that her breast cancer was caused by some other factor, environment, lifestyle, family risk factors, age, whatever the case might be. But we don't know what those risk factors are.
Right.
And therefore, we don't know whether or not you share those risk factors. And so that's a scenario where we recommend for women who have a family history of breast cancer that we would do a risk assessment where we look at their family history and we say, okay, based on these data points, they are considered at higher risk of breast cancer than their peers, and they may still need close screening. Maybe not necessarily to the degree that an individual with a Brca mutation, who probably would not recommend a double mastectomy, but they may need higher screening, higher rate of screening. They may need closer screening, additional screenings beyond a mammogram, because they have a family history of breast cancer that at this point is unexplained. So we want to be more conservative and screen all of the at-risk female relatives a little bit closer until we can try to find out what that risk factor is.
Right. That was so helpful to hear. And that's really good news that, there's not likely to be something. And again, from the research I had done, my mind is at ease knowing my mom doesn't have BRCA. I know it's just a much better situation. And, I'm really interested in all of this stuff, but I don't know if it's my control or my curiosity. I always think or just my pessimism, or being a Jewish comedian who's dark. I'm just there's gotta be something, because my life has been so colored by illness. My dad dying of ALS, right. My mom, telling me when she was young, my mom died young of leukemia, that in and of itself, it's why did her mom die young? And why was she diagnosed young? And her aunt died of it. And my dad has this thing, and yet nothing could show up. It's just so interesting. So I want to know, but do I?
Yeah. And I will say, that is not an uncommon thing we hear. Nobody goes into the genetic testing process saying, ooh, I hope I'm positive.
Right.
But when you have a family history that is concerning, when you have a person in front of you, a woman who has breast cancer at a young age, and they have a negative genetic test, it is definitely unsatisfying to be able to answer that why question, and to be able to provide that woman's family with information that they can use. So yes, while a negative genetic test for most people is a good thing, they also look at the other side and say, well, okay, but I'm 37 years old and I have breast cancer. Why? And we haven't been able to answer that. So everything that you're saying is frankly very normal. When you have the experiences that you've had and trying to understand, what your risk is, what do I need to do so I don't end up like my family, but knowing that in some cases we don't know, and we may not be able to prevent anything. And so it's just being informed and proactive.
Yeah. Thank you for providing that information and validating my feelings. That's very nice. And I think it's just also dotting the I's and crossing the T's. I mean, because of my really piquing curiosity that day by day is just going further down this road with this podcast, on the small random chance there was something and I'm out here telling everyone how important this is and sharing these stories, I would just never forgive myself. Whoops, you randomly were preventable. I mean, how could I have that happen? So I'm thinking about doing it probably in the next few months. I would just rather know. And if I don't need to know anything, then great. Then that's great. So thank you for sharing that. And one more example I wanted to give. I actually feel kind of emotional about this, so I wasn't sure if I was going to bring it up, but I feel it'd be a missed opportunity for other people. I'm in the Big Sisters program. So in that program as of 2020, that was something I decided to do based on everything going on. It's been the most positive thing that I've ever done. And I matched with a 9-year-old girl, and her mother unfortunately had stage 4 metastatic breast cancer, and which is what my mom had. And it's been a really beautiful experience, although she's 9, connecting. And when I first met her, I said, my mom has stage 4 breast cancer too. And she was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we met. I can't believe it, as if it was so random. I'm like, well, it was actually a program, but you're 9 and you don't understand. So
right.
Her mom was so wonderful, and unfortunately died actually just a few days ago. And she was diagnosed last May, and she had Brca. And the fact that, we started off 2020 with our conversation and the event, and I had no idea how much Braca would impact my life from this family. I'm really, really dealing with how frustrated I am that, I mean, a single mom who raises two girls, that it's found so late and had a hereditary gene. I just want to share that for anyone listening, if that can inspire someone to take action and test. Now, specifically, my question for you is, this is a large family, a large Hispanic family. There's lots of cousins, aunts. I'm hoping that there can be a conversation around testing. I don't know what their insurance situation is. It's uncomfortable to bring this up, that there's things they can do. Do you know and of any organizations that help? Does anything come to mind on how I can be most helpful?
So I think starting off with, you could go to FORCE, which is Facing Our Risk of Cancer Empowered. It's a support group and support services for individuals at risk for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, which is what Brca causes. I think they may be able to provide some information and resources. Like I said, genetic testing is something that is much more accessible. But yes, I mean, there's always barriers and limitations to everything.
Right.
It's hard when I don't know a lot of the details. Right. And she's not my patient, but I definitely would encourage the family to, try to obtain her records, particularly any genetic testing that she's had, pathology, things like that. And, find if they have a primary doctor that they really like, that seems well-informed, somebody to help potentially guide them through this. But I think FORCE might be a really great place to start with, if they have any barriers, financial, otherwise, they may be able to help at least point them in the right direction.
Okay. Thank you. I so appreciate that. And worth asking if someone else is involved or knows someone that might use that resource. I've never heard of that. So thank you so much. And for the girls, 9, 11, is there a certain age you recommend? It's supposed to be after 18, right? Or at least after puberty. So they don't need to do that now, or? So
typically with Brca, we're dealing with adult onset cancer risks. Okay. At 9 and 11, I typically don't recommend testing at that age. For adult onset conditions, we do recommend testing after age 18 when the children, so then they become the patient, can consent for the test. Right. Typically we recommend screening. The current guidelines recommend screening starting at age 25. Okay. So usually what I recommend for my younger patients, or those that have young children is, start the conversation. Hopefully these two girls are going to have some really great support. Unfortunately now that their mom is gone, and, I understand, losing a big part of your life at a young age. So I hope that they will be able to find a new person to lean on. But starting those conversations, I'm sure that their mom did a great job of having those conversations with them at 9 and 11. But ultimately at 18, they can consent to the genetic test. We do typically recommend they wait closer to age 25. But it's a conversation that can happen at any time. I have patients who are 18, 19, come and see me, and we have the discussion about testing now versus testing in, 4 to 5 years, and what that looks like, so that they feel comfortable one way or the other.
Great. Thank you for clarifying. And especially if, they have cousins that are 20s and 30s, and maybe they might be interested. And yeah, it's hard too. I always want to tell everyone everything, and it's so personal, but thank you so much. I really appreciate your perspective and getting some of those logistics squared away and sharing this information. Is there something that you wish I had asked you before we wrapped up? Do you have closing thoughts, takeaways that people might want to consider moving forward?
Like I said, I think the biggest thing for me is to be informed, one way or the other, that you have you have choices, whether it's to do the genetic testing, to not do the genetic testing, how you use that information, what decisions that you make. It is not a one-way road, but there are pros and cons to any test, including genetic testing. And so I do recommend, if you have concerns about your family history of cancer, if you have questions about genetic testing, talk to your primary doctor. Ladies, talk to your OBGYN. Ask to speak with a genetic counselor. We can have those discussions. And like I said, we can talk about pros and cons, insurance coverage. Some people have concerns about genetic discrimination, whether or not genetic results can impact insurance coverage and somebody's ability to get insurance. So the answer is it depends. There is a federal law called GINA, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. This law states if you undergo genetic testing and test positive, you cannot lose your health insurance or employment. You can't be charged a higher premium. You cannot lose your health insurance. Your employer cannot deny you employment because of your risk of cancer. However, it can impact your ability to obtain life insurance, long-term care insurance, and disability insurance. So particularly for younger people like us, the two young girls that you talked about when they turned 18, some people haven't thought about life insurance at 18, 25, whatever. And so we do recommend thinking about, perhaps exploring what a life insurance policy would cost. In the event that they test positive for Brca or any other genetic mutation, it could impact the type of plan that they may be offered or their ability to get life insurance in general.
So unless you have the life insurance beforehand.
Already. Correct.
That's so complicated.
Yes.
Okay.
So that's, like I said, that's what I think is the benefit of, if you have questions, interest in genetic testing, taking that time, speaking with a genetic counselor. We can go through all of those, the nuts and bolts and the nooks and crannies of all of this in that 30-minute to 1 hour conversation. So like I said, ultimately at the end, you make the best decision, either yes, no, or in many cases, not right now. Get those ducks in a row and then maybe come back later.
I'm sorry, I didn't ask earlier. I'm curious, are you open to sharing a little bit about your experience into why you are so passionate specifically about your mom and your aunt, if that's okay to connect that full circle?
Yeah. So part of the reason I became a genetic counselor is because of my personal experience. So my mom is a breast cancer survivor. She was diagnosed at age 48 with triple negative breast cancer, which in some cases can be a more aggressive subtype of breast cancer. She needed surgery, chemotherapy, radiation. I was in my first year of college, so it was interesting navigating that. It was something that was not a foreign concept to our family. My mom's sister was initially diagnosed with breast cancer at age 37 when I was 1. Much more aggressive, much more advanced than my mom. Unfortunately, she had multiple rounds of chemotherapy, a really big breast surgery. And then unfortunately, 13 years later, her breast cancer had metastasized to her bones and her liver. And she passed away ultimately from metastasis to the lungs and the brain about 11 years ago. And so we have pictures of my mom with her bald head and my aunt with her bald head after her metastasis. And so breast cancer and the mortality and the way it can impact family members is not a foreign concept to me. It's something that when I first became a genetic counselor, I actually wasn't sure I wanted to do cancer genetics because I thought it would be too close to home. But in fact, it's been the complete opposite. I meet with so many individuals who are my age, who have similar experiences, or, young women with breast cancer. And I feel like it's a point that I can I can relate to them, where they feel like I'm not just a mouthpiece talking about genetic testing, but I can relate to their experiences. So I think in general, I hope it's made me a better genetic counselor. I think it's maybe made me more informed to help my mom through, her continued journey with her breast cancer. Thankfully, she's, now 13 years out and has been healthy since. But as I'm sure you know, Chelsea, once you or a family member has cancer of any kind, even when it's in remission, it's not something that ever really goes away. And I think that we also in medicine, but also in my personal life, it's something that we have to be cognizant of. So I think my journey, not only as a woman who has family members who've had breast cancer, but also as a genetic counselor, it's a very unique perspective.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's so beautiful that you are able to really connect with some of these people or all of these people coming in. That's really selfless and beautiful. And also you have degrees. I mean, it's just like, I feel like I can relate to people, but I don't have a master's degree in it. So I think it's really amazing that you have all of these things coming together and helping others. So thank you for what you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. It's always good to share.
Yes. Sharing makes it a little more accessible, and it makes it a little bit safer for someone else to hopefully share their story. Normally I ask where people can find you online or connect with you, but I actually wanted to ask the version of this to a genetics counselor. Where can people work with you if that's an option, if their insurance is accepted by you? How might that work?
So as I said earlier, I am a genetic counselor at UCLA. You can Google UCLA Cancer Genetics. There are 6 of us at UCLA. We're all fantastic. But if you wanted to meet specifically with me, you can click on my picture. And I have a couple of different offices throughout Southern California. So you can call and make an appointment. I'm currently working remotely. So we're doing a lot of virtual visits, which is great because of COVID. But you can call our office. If you've never been seen at UCLA, then we can determine whether or not your insurance is accepted by the institution. But if it's not for any reason, we also have other fantastic resources. And, Southern California is not without. So, there are other great services available. But yes, you can go to our website and contact either me or contact any of my colleagues. And yeah, we can get that process started.
Okay, fantastic. And is that for people specifically in Southern California, or could someone in another city or state potentially work for you? Or is that not an option, just to clarify that?
That's a really, really good question. So technically in California, I can see anybody. Okay. I have a California genetic counseling license. Because of COVID, the license restrictions were waived and we were allowed to see patients in other states. I'd be very honest, I don't know what the current state, I don't know if that has been extended through 2021. Mm-hmm. So if you live in another state, if that state requires a genetic counseling license, since I only have a license in California, I may not be able to see you, but you could always contact our office. They can get you in touch with me. We can try to find a genetic counselor in your area. Or you can always go to nsgc.org. And there's a find a genetic counselor function on that website. It's our National Society of Genetic Counselors. And you can input your zip code or your state or your city, and it will come up with any genetic counselor within a certain mile radius. So you live in another state, I can try to help you, but the NSGC website would also be a great resource.
Amazing. That is so helpful.
It is. You just type in uclahealth.org/cancer genetics.
Great. And there's like a number on there or something. I'm literally going to call this week and see if my insurance is taken by this. So I'm also.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways to get a hold of us. There's a general email that, like a generic cancer genetics email that you can email us. Okay. You can also click on expert team, and you can click specifically on my picture. My offices will come up.
It's cancer genetics at mednet.ucla.edu.
Yep, that's it.
Cool. We're linking it, and I'll link it as well. Great. Well, thank you, Erica. That is it. We are right at 12:59. I so appreciate your time. I know you have a lot going on.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Oh, thank you, Erica. Let you know when it's out too. Yep.
Yes, definitely. I was just going to ask.
Yes,
all right.
Probably in a few months. Okay. Talk to you soon.
Sounds good.
All right.
Bye, Chelsea.